Thanks. Right into it. Next slide, please. So today I'll be talking about tactical maps and what we mean by them and how they fit into other maps and data products that we are more familiar with. I'll introduce some examples of what tactical maps can look like and then discuss how we have been implementing them and testing them because they need to be iterated to be fully useful for crewed exploration. Next slide, please. So starting with defining these tactile maps, I want to emphasize that we're starting a conceptual conversation about how these maps fit into existing products, and they need to be tested and iterated to be applied during crewed missions. Next slide, please. So to intro this, we use maps for two different types of science applications. On the left-hand side, we have fundamental science, and these are maps that either result from scientific investigations, so they are the science themselves, or they're providing context for other scientific investigations that are being conducted in an area, and they're used to guide future research. Where do we want to go to advance our knowledge? On the other hand, for applied science, we use maps to identify the nature, location, and accessibility of scientific points of interest. Where do we want to go? Hazards, how do we get there? And resources, when we're there, what can we use? Next slide, please. So examples of these two map products used for these two different types of science. On the left, we have the Lunar South Pole clip of the Unified Geologic Map of the Moon. So your traditional geologic maps, these can be USGS SIM or other map type products, but the classic geologic map. On the right-hand side, we have more specialized maps like what Isaac was just talking about. For example, slope restricted versus unrestricted for a portion of the Lunar South Pole. And these are both, products that we're familiar with and used to generating. Next slide, please. Tactical maps are inspired by the military geology maps. These are the ones that Dave Soller introduced earlier and Isaac was talking about, producing both through the USGS and the US Army, demonstrating how geologic information and interpretations can be leveraged for engineer intelligence and base development in those use cases. So in the bottom, we have 3 insets of the geology of Tinian and the Mariana Islands military geology maps. So on the left, geology, different colors showing units and lines showing structure. And then the center and right side, engineering materials and soil, are different ways to classify the surface based on what sort of information you're trying to extract. So what does the upper 1 meter of regolith look like? How can you classify those soils based on their units, characteristics, and thicknesses? Next slide, please. So coming back to fundamental versus applied science, these tactical maps kind of bridge them. They both draw from those and contribute to those two different types of sciences. They have the lengthier tabulated descriptions of characteristics that are similar to what is described in a traditional geologic map, but they use as many diverse data sets and map layers that you can, similar to the applied science side. So simultaneously helping scientists understand and contextualize geology problems. Why are we going there? What do we know? What do we not know? And help decision makers minimize risk. How do you get there? What are the hazards and resources that you can use? So I'll demonstrate this in the next section of this talk about these tactical maps are produced through the geologist's eyes. So they're not just data analysis or just geologic characterization, but geologic view of data. Next slide, please. So I'll show 3 tactical maps. As an example, there are more that you can make under this umbrella tactical map term, but the 3 I'll be showing are for the red circle, 2-kilometer radius circle in the Daguralosh Rim to candidate landing site. I want to emphasize that these maps are not scientific products yet, but are meant to be generalized examples of how these concepts can be applied. Next slide, please. So geologic character, this is really similar to the traditional geologic maps that we're used to seeing. So comprehensive geologic characterization of the site, database descriptions, bulk characteristics for units and linear features. But these take the next step to creating testable interpretations that aid exploration. So this includes plausible hypotheses of units and features within the area and having degrees of confidence with those interpretations. For example, the red triangle with a confidence 4 tells us whoever the traverse planning team is, that we get crew there and they'll likely be faster at that station than somewhere like the green triangle with a lower confidence 3 out of 5. So that might take more time because we're truly like discovering things. Similarly, you want to have a testable order of events for the area so that you know where to go, like the yellow triangle, to test which unit is older or younger. And this throws back to Kelsey's talk about the geochronology of the study site and how all of this information is inherently in those traditional geologic maps that we make, but not explicit. And this is making it explicit to aid exploration. Next slide, please. Moving on to similar to those engineering materials and soils, you can look at rocky terrain in a site. So Jim Rice and others have identified individual boulders and boulder fields in the Geologic Crater 2 rim site, such as the dark orange on the right-hand side. Those are all the rocky boulder fields. But you can also start to interrogate different data sets from your geologist's eye to expect where you would think regolith cover would be thicker or thinner. So thinner being the lighter orange and thicker being the yellow. And that tells whoever the traverse planning team is or different stakeholders how ease of access and trafficability it is over the area based on a geologist's interpretation. So these kind of layers will not just identify points of interest based on rocky terrain, but also how difficult it might be to traverse. Next slide, please. The last kind of tactile map that I will introduce here is mineral abundances. So on the bottom, we have 3 different relative contours of mineral abundance for olivine, clinopyroxene, orthopyroxene from the Kaguya Spectral Profiler. And these have been amalgamated into what is kind of like a heat map on the right-hand side, with low mineral abundance being the lightest pink and increasing in mineral abundance to the darkest pink with labels of what kind of mineral the crew might expect if they get there. So this aids exploration by streamlining different data sets into one layer, but also helping to understand where you want to go for different minerals or whatever resources being shown in this kind of heat map. This can be done for ice or other resources like Jake Bleacher was talking about. Next slide, please. So now that we have various types of tactical map products that we're making, each one is showing disparate information. So how do we put those all into one or a handful of products to be most useful for different stakeholders? And do different stakeholders need different versions? Next slide, please. So this is one example of what a merged map may look like. So there's various cartographic ways to present all these maps in one product. For example, throwing back to that orange map of the rocky outcrops, there's a stipple pattern on here, black dots that represent all that dark orange areas that were identified as rocky. You can also use colored lines. So we're translating those mineral heat maps into colored relative contour lines with labels for what kind of mineral you might expect in the area. And then back to those triangles that indicated questions that we have. You can use queried markers that can identify unknowns or testable hypotheses that the crews will be able to investigate or collect samples or photograph to help us better improve our understanding of the site. Similarly, you can mix and match these cartographic ways to present all these tactile maps based on what stakeholders want. So the people who are planning the traverse team might not need all the geologic information that goes into it, whereas the crew will want that because they want to have the geologic context for the station that they're approaching. Next slide, please.
Just over 1 minute.
Thanks. As a shout out, and I think Kelsey mentioned this, JET 5, so Joint Extravehicular Activities and Human Surface Mobility Test Team, implement number 5, is testing which of these products is useful and how to present them to different parts of that flowchart that she showed. And I look forward to presenting more information about this at League in September. Next slide, please. So I want to leave with this takeaway that tactical maps leverage the geologist's eye and our interpretation of data to synthesize them into action-biased products, things that are usable by a variety of stakeholders that enable fundamental scientific exploration within the bounds of what applied science allows. We want to go to a new site on the moon. There are limitations based on engineering constraints and crew safety, but we want to maximize our science as best possible. And with that, I'll thank the JET 3 and JET 5 science teams and take questions